1.2 million. That is the number of refugees that have arrived in Germany since 2015. We do story sharing forums with refugees and Berlin locals. In these story sharings, refugees and Berlin locals are allowed to ask each other anything they want. Questions that are regarded as too impolite or too direct. Why do Germans always sit away from us on the bus? Are all German songs Nazi songs? Why do Germans think we're terrorists? Anna, an elderly German participant, had just admitted her feelings of hatred for a woman she knew from a local language cafe. That woman wore a niqab, a veil that covers everything but the eyes. She said that she cannot imagine that this woman is veiled by her own choice. She would always feel an inner aggression towards her when she would speak to that woman. Now, normally in Germany, you would not admit such feelings of hatred, but because you would be afraid of being judged a racist. But given the atmosphere of trust that we had cultivated in the room, we were able to talk about it openly, and I was able, as a facilitator, to do some assumption testing with her. So I asked her, you know, well, how do you feel if that woman takes off her niqab and when only other women are around in the room? And she said, well, then it's a completely different story. I don't feel any aggression towards her whatsoever anymore. And we talked further about this in the group. And finally, after further exploring her feelings, Anne concluded, well, I guess I'm mostly angry at myself for having biases against her. I think that most of my aggressions are actually directed against myself. And when she talked to that woman later, she learned that it's completely normal for her to wear a niqab. It's like brushing her teeth, and she feels comfortable doing so. So Anna had felt intruded upon, but really, she knows that nothing will change the history of refugees. But talking about it and building new relationships, forming a connection, that is justice. And that is what we try to do. In Berlin, where I live and work, 80,000 refugees have come since 2015. And I founded the organization Resolute. Resolute seeks to empower refugees and Berlin locals with conflict resolution skills, story sharing, and mental health awareness, and peer mediation workshops. So Resolute is one of the only forums that exists that creates an atmosphere of trust where people are able to talk about difficult situations, difficult topics such as racism, cultural misunderstanding, and hatred in a safe environment and safe space. And here are some of the things that we have learned. Most of the refugees are traumatized and are deeply in need for psychological aid. The contact among refugees and Germans is very, very limited because refugees are placed in refugee shelters in the far outskirts of cities in Germany or in the countryside. But still, of course, racially biased incidents do occur on a daily basis in public spaces. And there is a lack of privacy and a lack of space and resources for refugees in the refugee centers because they don't have, 800 people are living in a shelter and they don't have anything there. And number 5, socioeconomic isolation further creates psychological damage because people are looking for employment and they don't receive it. And they live in an unclear situation whether they will receive asylum or not. Now, a key lesson I learned myself personally when doing these dialogue workshops, peer mediation workshops, was about, as you may all know, authenticity. And we've mentioned this earlier. So in one of our workshops, a young man from Afghanistan got up and he shared with us all in the group the recent loss of his entire family. In the blink of an eye, he lost his entire family due to a bomb attack, and he learned about this in the news. So we were all very shocked in the room. We had tears in our eyes, and we were struggling how to respond. And I, as the facilitator, had a choice to either remain professional or share about my own personal story about the recent death of my father. So I took a deep breath, and with great difficulty, I was able to share my story. And it did what I hoped it would. It encouraged people to open up more and talk about their own stories of loss. So I strongly believe that vulnerability triggers authenticity. So I encourage all of you to become more vulnerable, to be authentic. because it triggers trust and it allows for richer discussions. Now, as intercultural facilitators, we're dealing with very strong emotions. People talk about warfare, they talk about violence, they talk about persecution, and it is not easy to deal with such topics. So I think authenticity is the key. And normally I understand as mediators we would not share such personal stories when we're doing a mediation with the parties. But in the context of trauma, prosecution, and warfare, it is highly, from my perspective, it makes a lot of sense to allow for such a room and to do that. And that brings me to my next point and the central theme, the principle of neutrality. Can we remain neutral as mediators, as facilitators? Or should we step up rather and go into these homes where neighbors and nations are divided and where people are not talking to each other? So I think we need to use the tools of mediation to go out there to try to bridge that gap. And we need to view immigration as a social issue, as I view it, because we are the ones that can make a change, and we are the ones that can, bring people at one table and talk about these difficult topics and use dialogue as a tool, because I strongly believe in a world that's becoming ever more polarized, that dialogue is really the only hope that we have left. And of course, another lesson I learned was about cultural misunderstandings, cultural differences. One of our freshly baked peer mediators, Mohammed, in one of our last peer mediation workshops in a shelter of 800 people in Berlin, stood up in the very last session of our workshop, and we were ready to hand out certificates already, and he said, you know what, I don't think this is it. I think a mediator has to be old, has to be male, has to have a lot of life experience. Not everyone can be a mediator. And thankfully the translation was a bit delayed because we are working with Arabic translators. So I was like, able to hold my temper in that situation, and then, talked a bit about how important education is in Germany. And, 50% of our trainers is female. We are all in our late 20s or 30s. But then it occurred to me that actually we had learned a valuable lesson here, because I think that we have to look even closer at the needs of our participants and their backgrounds. And I think that Mohammed actually created value in telling us that, so we can work with that. We cannot look away, and we can use that as a tool for our work that we're doing when we're empowering individuals with conflict resolution skills. And also, I think you should never underestimate tradition. Another colleague of Mohammed told me the story how he mediated a case. He was at the at the room of two families that were having a conflict, and they were talking for hours, and they were trying to come to an agreement, but they didn't reach an agreement. So then he did something really funny. He refused to drink the tea that he was offered by one of the parties. Now, not drinking the offered tea in Syria is considered a very big affront. And faced with this social crisis, the parties actually decided to better make up and come to an agreement together. and that worked, so this is wonderful. So I would say always when you're doing this work, think about the rewards of your work. For me, the biggest reward has been to give people a voice, to be able to talk to one another, listen to one another, and also one of our participants made this beautiful piece of art to promote peer mediation as a systemic system, as a method in his shelter. And I was very proud of him because he also casually mentioned that he had already mediated 6 cases since completing the training. So I was proud of him, everybody at Resolute, and all of us. And here are the 5 things that I think I learned, and of course this is a learning experience, so there will be many more to come. We all want peace. So we need to ask ourselves, where am I needed the most to help heal the divide? And we all want to make a change. So in the face of a world that's becoming more polarized, we need to step up in our communities and make a change. It is hard work, as you know, but it is an adventure and it is rewarding. And I would dare all of you to be authentic, to be vulnerable, and remember the rewards of your work, because it's always more fulfilling to make peace than to close your eyes before injustice. Thank you.